Shalom, my name is Esther Shor. Welcome to the four-part series of virtual conversations and lectures to explore the unprecedented story of the revival of the Hebrew language, which continues evolving and reinventing itself to this day. Today, the 21st of the Jewish month of Tevet, which is the birthday of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, was chosen by the Israeli government in 2012 to be the day to celebrate the Hebrew language every year. As a Hebrew lecturer at Brandeis University, where one can study Hebrew from the beginning level to advance on topics such as theater arts, Israeli film, business in a startup nation, minorities in Israel, the history of the Hebrew language, and more, I know what it takes to teach a language. So I want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and appreciation to all the Hebrew administrators, teachers, parents, and the students around the world for their hard work and devotion in teaching, learning, and keeping the Hebrew language alive. This series, How to Revive a Dead Language in 100 Years, is organized by the Consulate General of Israel to New England and co-hosted by Brandeis University's Hebrew program, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, the Jewish Studies program at Colby College, the Middlebury School, Language Schools, Hebrew College, and Northeastern University Hillel. First of all, I'm honored to invite Ambassador Meron Reuven, the Consul General of Israel to New England, to share his introductory remarks. Ambassador Reuven has served as the Consul General of Israel to New England since November 2020. During his diplomatic career, spanning over 3 decades, Ambassador Reuven has served in various positions, including roles at the Israeli Embassy in Chile and Mexico, and as an ambassador at Paraguay, Bolivia, and Colombia. Reuven also served as Israel's ambassador to the UN between 2010 and 2011, and as Israel's chief of the State Protocol from 2015 to 2020. Ambassador Reuven was born in South Africa and made Aliyah from the UK to Israel in 1974, where he studied diplomacy and international relations at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. During his military service, Ambassador Reuven was an air traffic controller in the Israeli Air Force. Reuven is father to Chen and Liad and partner to David. Please, Ambassador Reuven.
Thank you very much. Shalom, Boker Tov, Tzoraim Tovim, Erev Tov. Hello and welcome to the hundreds of people that are watching us live from around the world through Zoom or Facebook. Thank you, Esther, for this introduction. We'll go back to it in a minute, but first it's an honor for me to open our series on the revival of a sleeping beauty known as the Hebrew language. I would like to cordially thank our partners, the academic institutions from Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, Brandeis University Hebrew Program, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, the Jewish Studies Program at Colby College, Middlebury Language Schools, Hebrew College, and Northeastern University Hillel. This fascinating series could not have happened without your support and participation. Toda Rabba. As Esther mentioned, I made Aliyah to Israel with my mother at the age of 12. As an English speaker who could not even recite the Aleph Bet correctly, Hebrew quickly became one of the major challenges that I had to overcome as a new immigrant. Until then, my encounters with this teeth-breaking language were mostly limited to occasional ceremonies at our neighborhood synagogue in South Africa, where my father used to sing with the local choir. Now I was thrown into a completely new environment, a new country, a new culture, and so many new words to learn. And how can you even start to tell the difference between chet and chaf and Aleph and Ain. In some sense, I felt as pioneering as Itamar ben Avi, Eliezer Ben Yehuda's firstborn, and the first child who was raised solely on the Hebrew language since birth. Now, a few decades later, I have learned the Aleph Bet syntax and grammar, but my daughters still correct my Hebrew from time to time. This is the way Jewish people who immigrated to Israel have learned Hebrew from scratch throughout the past 100 years or so, walking in the streets, watching movies, speaking to friends, family, or random acquaintances, and that's how this man-made miracle was created, a living language that still keeps evolving and circulating to this very day. The consulate staff and I are excited to be hosting such a phenomenal group of speakers who will dissect the story of this lingual evolution from different and unique perspectives. Gil Hovav, Gilad Zuckerman, Guy Sharet, and Tamar Elam Gindin. I would especially like to thank our Director of Cultural Affairs, Amir Tadmor, for his hard work on this virtual series. I hope now that you will enjoy how to revive a dead language in 100 years. איך לחיות שפה מחדש ב100 שנה. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Reuven. Indeed, we would not have modern Hebrew as a spoken language today without Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda was born in 1858, seeing the Bulgarian people regaining independence and reviving their nation on their national soil on 1877. Ben Yehuda was inspired to believe that the Jews deserved the same. They should return to their land of Eretz Israel and revive their language to become a spoken language again. When he immigrated to Palestine at the age of 23, he was excited to hear people speak Hebrew so freely and naturally. Ben Yehuda wanted all the Jews in Palestine to speak only Hebrew, and he had a plan, which started with his family. He made his wife Deborah promise him that their first child, Itamar ben Avi, will be the first child in modern history to speak only Hebrew. It was an important symbolic event for Ben Yehuda, who thought of it as a living proof that the revival of the Hebrew language is possible. Raising a child only in Hebrew required words for everyday life, so Ben Yehuda started creating new words for his son. Therefore, the language grew in parallel with Itamar. Inspired by the Russian, Ben Yehuda believed that the transition of Hebrew into a living language had to go through the schools, from which it will go into the homes. To attract adults to his idea and introduce new words, Ben Yehuda published his own newspaper, Hatzvi. He also started compiling a 17-volume dictionary, a complete dictionary of ancient and modern Hebrew, working sometimes 18 hours a day. Simultaneously, Ben Yehuda founded the Hebrew Language Council, Vad Halashon HaIvrit, which later changed its name to Hebrew Language Academy, Haakademia Lalashon HaIvrit, and became the supreme authority on all matters pertaining to the Hebrew language. Ben Yehuda was not alone. The year that he immigrated to Palestine, 1881, also saw the first Aliyah, an immigration wave of young, educated, and idealistic Jewish settlers of Israel. In the following 40 years, a core of young Hebrew language speakers was formed with Hebrew as their symbol of their linguistic nationalism. In November 1922, the British Mandate authorities recognized Hebrew as the official language of the Jews in Palestine. Ben Yehuda's lifelong dream was fulfilled. Sadly, only 1 month later, he passed away. But was the Hebrew language dead to begin with? The philologist Chaim Rabin noted that in 1879, the year of Ben Yehuda's first article, over 50% of all Jewish male, were able to understand the daily prayers, etc. And some 20% could read a Hebrew book of average difficulty. Ben Yehuda, says Jack Fellman of Bar-Ilan University, was the prophet and propagandist, the theoretician, the tactician, and the sign and symbol of the revival. Now I'm happy to invite Gil Hovav to talk about his great-grandfather, the prophet. Gil Hovav is Israel's leading culinary journalist, author, and publisher. Hovav reveals the real story of the revival of the Hebrew language from a personal point of view. In his playful style, Hovav will describe these unprecedented miracles through the little secrets that were kept by his family for more than 100 years. Hovav comes from one of the most respected lineage in the Jewish world. He's the great-grandson of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, the grandson of Itamar Ben Avi, who began modern Hebrew journalism, and the son of Moshe and Drora Hovav, founding members of the Israel modern day public radio. You're welcome to write your questions for Gil Hovav using Q&A feature on Zoom, or comment on Facebook Live, and he will be happy to answer them after his presentation. בבקשה, גיל.
Shalom, everybody. Toda rabba, Esther. I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you for inviting me to celebrate Hebrew with all of you in English. We promised that it's going to be personal, so I'll start with a confession. In my family, the Ben Yehuda family, we tend to rank cities around the world according to the size of the Ben Yehuda street that we got. So Jerusalem is great, Tel Aviv is wonderful, it's a big avenue parallel to the beach, Be'er Sheva, Kfar Saba, Haifa, quite small, but they were always communists, so we never trusted them. Boston has a long way to go, but maybe until next time, you have the time to arrange something. So when I come and visit, when COVID is gone, we'll have a Ben Yehuda street in Boston. So I want to share with you the Ben Yehuda story, but not through the Wikipedia entry that we can all read, but through the little dark secrets that were kept in the family. So I'll start near the end. Picture me about 30 years ago when I was a very, very young apprentice or beginner in a newspaper, in a local newspaper in Jerusalem, sitting at the desk and getting word that it happened yet again. What happened yet again? So if you were Jerusalemites, you would have known that in Jerusalem we have a very nice tradition that at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, members of the ultra-Orthodox community, the Neturei Karta community in Jerusalem, arm themselves with bats and axes and bottles of black spray, go in the middle of the night to the old Jewish cemetery in the Mount of Olives, break into the burial plot of my family, which is surrounded by a fence, desecrate all the graves and write nasty graffitis in black tar or in black spray on the broken graves. And then City Hall fixes it, and that it happens yet again and again for years and decades. And it happened yet again, and I didn't know what to do. Whether I should phone my aunt who was still alive and tell her that the graves of her parents and her grandparents and her uncles were desecrated yet again. It's not a pleasant piece of news to convey to an elderly aunt. I won't tell you what I did. If you behave, maybe I'll tell you in the end. But in the meantime, let's think about it for a minute. What was it, and what is it still, in this person, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, in this annoying person, short, red-headed, coughing blood, he had tuberculosis, very sensitive about dignity and respect and honor, lacking any sense of humor, quite violent. What was it and what is it still in his figure that makes people so charged with him, that makes members of the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem go up to the Mount of Olives every year and every year to, you know, to write nasty curses on his grave on one hand, and on the other hand, makes UNESCO, the culture organization of the United Nations, declare him in a big ceremony in Paris about 15 or 20 years ago as one of Western civilization's greatest culture figures. It was a big ceremony with 3 winners of this prize, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, Isaac Newton, and Haydn. None of them came, but still. And this is 99 years after his death. He died in 1922. We're in 2021. So Eliezer Perelman, that's his original name, was born in 1858 in Lithuania, but generally we say Russia. Nowadays it's in Belarus, in a little town called Luzhki, to a traditional Jewish family of the mid-19th century, very religious, very poor, lots of children. A few years after he was born, his father passed away and his mom was left with 5 children. And within a few years, she realized that she cannot keep all her children with her. She simply did not have enough bread to put on the table for 5 children. And she had to make a satanic choice. Nowadays, to us, it looks dreadful, but at the time it was quite common. One of the kids had to be sent away from home. And she chose little Eliezer because she said he is the wittiest. And maybe with his wits, he'll be able to survive without a motherly love. And he was sent to be educated at the house of a distant uncle, very religious, very strict, totally unhappy about the fact that he had yet another mouth to feed. And he grew up without love. Years later, when he was already Eliezer Ben Yehuda, known all over the world, an American journalist interviewed him. And as we journalists say in the beginning of an interview, this American journalist said, well, to begin with, maybe you would tell me a bit about your childhood. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda snapped, I didn't have one, which is true. He did not have a childhood. We're talking about the mid-19th century. Hebrew is, if not dead, totally dormant for 2,000 years. Think about Latin today, it would be the same. So it's the language of prayer. Some people can read it. Nobody speaks it. It's not the mother tongue of any child in the world. And since it's the mid-19th century and it's the Enlightenment era, Tkufat HaHaskala, as we say in Hebrew, Jewish scholars in Germany and north of France start toying with their biblical Hebrew just to see whether it is still alive, whether modern writings could be translated into this ancient semi-dead language. And one of Eliezer Perelman's rabbis in the yeshiva in which he was studying, and he was immediately recognized as an Ilui, a genius, was a Hebrew scholar. And through him, the young man, Eliezer Perelman, got hold of a text in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew. Very naive, very simple, very poor. Do you know what was the first secular book that the reviver of the Hebrew language read in Hebrew, not the Bible, the Talmud, the Mishnah, this of course was in Hebrew, but the first outer book, as we say, that the reviver of Hebrew read, it was Robinson Crusoe, a very naive translation of Robinson Crusoe into biblical Hebrew, and he falls in love with this language, and he knows that from now on is never going to let it go. Now, Jewish adolescents at that time were forbidden. It was forbidden for them to read outer books. They were supposed to read only the Bible, the Mishnah, and the Talmud, not Robinson Crusoe. And one night, his uncle, his very strict religious uncle, finds him reading secretly in bed a forbidden book in Hebrew. For God's sake, this is no Playboy. This is Robinson Crusoe. And he tells him, "You cast shame on me and on my household. Take your tefillin and leave." Think about it. A 15-year-old boy thrown out of home in the middle of the night in Eastern Europe in winter. Where would he go? No family, no home, nothing. He starts walking towards the east. He says, maybe one day I'll get to Moscow and it would be easier to get along in Moscow. This is Eastern Europe before the 2 world wars. It is scattered with Jewish towns and villages, and he wanders by foot from town to village, from village to town, being dependent on the hospitality of kind Jews. If he is picked up by one of them and taken to their home and being fed, wonderful. If not, he sleeps on a bench in the local synagogue. And here starts a chain of, it's funny to say miracles when we talk about Eliezer Ben Yehuda, because he was totally secular. He never believed for a single second of his life in God or in any religion, but still there is no other word. He was chased by a chain of miracles. Miracle number 1. Eliezer Perelman sleeps on a bench in a synagogue. Into the synagogue in the middle of the night walks a rich, affluent Jew, Mr. Tzvi Yonas, a vodka maker for the Tsar. These are my jeans. And he sees the young man sleeping on a bench in the synagogue, and he tells him, "Who are you? Why are you here? Don't you have anywhere to go?" And through the conversation, Mr. Yonas is so taken by the intelligence of the young man that he tells him, "You know what? Come and be a private tutor to my children." And Eliezer Perelman lives with the Yonas family for a year, teaching their children. And his way of thanking Mr. Yonas for saving him from poverty and from starving and from homelessness is coming to him after a year and telling him, "Well, Mr. Yonas, for the past year, I've been having an affair with your daughter. Actually, we're doing it. I'm going to marry her, and I'm going to take her to Palestine, where we would teach everybody to speak Hebrew." Translated to nowadays reality, it's as if someone would come to you and say, "I'm having a forbidden romance with your daughter. I'm going to marry her and take her to Rwanda in Africa, where we would teach everybody to speak Latin." Sounds very logical, right? But we're talking about miracles. Mr. Yonas looks at the fresh young man and says, "A brilliant idea. But before you take my daughter to this remote, God-forsaken Palestine filled with poverty and illness and whatever in the failing Ottoman Empire, let me send you to the Sorbonne at my expense. You're so brilliant. Study medicine. All over the world, they need doctors. When you'll get to Palestine to teach Hebrew, you will be able to support your family by being a doctor." Eliezer Perelman thinks about it and says, "You know what? I'll take it." Takes the money, goes to Paris, sends wonderful letters about his studies at the Sorbonne, of course, never sets foot in this university, sits in cafes with journalists and politicians, drinks all his money, and contracts tuberculosis. And is being sent to Algeria to recover, and in Algeria, 2 more miracles. Miracle number one, he meets a Sephardi Jew for the first time in his life. Not an Ashkenazi Jew, but a Sephardi Jew from Jerusalem. Now, Sephardi Jews in Jerusalem could speak a tiny bit of Hebrew. And it's for the first time in his life that Eliezer Perelman hears Hebrew spoken in the Sephardi accent, in the Sephardi pronunciation. Now, you know, it's totally different if we take a verse from our national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who, by the way, detested Eliezer Ben Yehuda, but was a great man, of course. So if we recite it in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, it's Shalom Rav Shuvech Tzipora Nechmedes. It's very round and soft and Central European. But if we recite it in a Sephardi accent, it's Shalom Rav Shuvech Tzipora Nechmada. It's much more majestic. And Eliezer Perelman hears this and says, this is what Hebrew would sound like. And this is how he spoke. This Lithuanian Jew from Eastern Europe spoke Hebrew in the Arabic accent, which is the Middle Eastern accent with Het and Ain and Resh and everything. Miracle number two, this secular person writes in his memoir that one night he sleeps in bed, suddenly there's a lightning in the sky and a big voice thunders upon him, the revival of the Jewish nation in its own language, on its own soil. And immediately he knows that this would be his vocation. He goes back to Paris, makes arrangements to immigrate to Palestine. We're talking about 1881. This is very, very, very early Zionism, 20 years before the Congress of Herzl. This is very early Zionism. And being at least honest, annoying, but honest, he writes a telegram to Dvora Yonas, his fiance, the daughter of Mr. Tzvi Yonas in Russia, saying, I'm really doing it. I'm really going to Palestine to teach everybody to speak Hebrew. This is no place for a young, educated, sophisticated, well-brought-up girl like yourself. You're exempt from this marriage. You may marry whoever you wish to. But Dvora is a tough cookie and she won't let anyone fire her from her marriage by telegram. She conducts a marriage by herself, without him. All night long, she dances with friends and relatives dressed in a white gown, and with no groom, the groom is in Paris. At midnight, she sits down for one last game of chess with her father, and her father plays tough. And he wins after 3 hours. And he says, Dvora, maybe it's a sign. You don't have to go there. And she looks at her father and says, I'm unlucky in games because I'm lucky in love. And she wears a black man's suit. You know that Jews were not allowed to travel freely in those times. So only at night she would ride trains and steal the border to the west until she gets to Paris, grabs him by the collar and says, you promised to marry me, and marry me you will. They get on a boat, sail to Palestine. On the way, they stop in Alexandria in Egypt and get married, and they get to Jaffa in 1881. Getting off the boat in Jaffa, Eliezer Perelman says 3 things. 1, my name is not Eliezer Perelman. I am Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda, not the son of a Judah, but the son of this land, of the Judean country. And this is the Zionist name that many Zionists took upon themselves after him to show that they left the diaspora behind. Number 2, he says, I did not come to Palestine to be in Jaffa. I want to go to Jerusalem. So everybody tells him, okay, tomorrow you'll go to Jerusalem. No, right away. Now, nowadays, the trip from Jaffa to Jerusalem would be 45, 60 minutes, depending on traffic. At that time, 8 hours, a carriage and a horse, and the road is infested with wolves and thieves and robbers and you name it. Immediately, he wants to go to Jerusalem. And 3, he looks at his wife, Dvora, and he says, we are making a vow that from this day on, we shall never utter one foreign word. We will speak only in Hebrew. And if we miss words, we will describe in Hebrew the words that we are missing until I come up with a Hebrew substitute to whatever we needed. Now think of it, they were very well educated. They knew the Tanakh, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud by heart. So they knew Hebrew, but in the Bible, there are no scrambled eggs. So if you want to make an omelet, there is no verb for making an omelet, and there is no word for an omelet. Now, the natural thing to do would be to say, Eliezer, I want to make an omelet, and then say omelet either in Russian or in German or in Yiddish or in French, in all the languages that they knew. No, you would say, I want to confuse eggs, and I will understand that you need a word for omelet, and I would think about the Bible, and I will remember that in the Bible there is this dish called chavitim that is made from eggs, and I will come up with the word chavita for an omelet, and with the word machvat for a pan, etc., etc., etc. But if by mistake we utter a foreign language, the other one, whoever didn't utter the foreign language, has every right to pinch whoever sinned with a foreign language. Remember those pinches? We'll come back to them. They get to Jerusalem. Life was very difficult. Jews in the cities in Palestine were not Zionists, not in Jerusalem, not in Jaffa, not in Tiberias, not in Safed. The Zionists, the very little Zionists that there were in the settlements, in the moshavot, in the villages, not in the cities. In the cities, Jews did not want to have any trouble with the Turkish rulers of the country. They wanted everything to be under the radar. So they were very hostile. They did not want to deal with Eliezer Ben Yehuda. They did not want to hire him as a teacher. Later on, they did not want to bury his dead, and they told upon him that he was a British spy, and he sat in jail for that, etc., etc. But if you come to a hostile city or community and you want everybody to start speaking Hebrew, a language which they don't speak, where would you start? It's difficult. So one day I was giving this lecture at a kindergarten in a kibbutz, and I asked the children, where would you start? And the children are, bewildered. But one kid says, I have an idea, sir, you must listen. Yes, he says, tell him to open a bank in Hebrew. Jews love money, it would work, it's a great idea. He didn't open a bank. There were three ways to promote Hebrew. One, communications. Immediately he starts two daily newspapers, two rival daily newspapers, which were not the respectable or respected newspapers of the era. Of course, the good newspapers were in the cultures of language, in either Arabic or French. But these leaflets, Jews would take them as a riddle, as a charade, just to see whether they can read whatever crazy Ben Yudke, as they called him, writes in the holy language. Number two, education. Eliezer Ben Yehuda says, my generation is lost, but children should be taught in Hebrew, and this is how Hebrew would enter the homes. But no teacher knew Hebrew, and no teachers were willing to teach in Hebrew because the parents didn't want their children to be taught in Hebrew. They wanted culture, they wanted French and Arabic. And there were no games, no songs, and no books in Hebrew. He wrote them all by himself, not with great talent, I must say. I read some of them, but at least the very few kindergarten teachers in the settlements that were willing to try had a few books to work with. And the last from the three, the short list of the three means of promoting Hebrew, we're talking about revolution, and there is no revolution without violence. So two stories about Ben Yehuda violence. One, we all know Rehovot. Rehovot is a nice city in the center of Israel with a very big university in the middle, of course, the Weizmann Institute. At the time, Rehovot is a village of Jewish farmers growing vines. And there is only one main street in Rehovot, in this tiny village, and it's a would-be avenue, not with trees, but with bushes on the sides. And at dusk, the Jewish Russian farmers would come back home from the vineyards and walk to and fro with their wives and talk about whatever happened during the day. The kids of Rehovot had permission from their teachers to hide behind the little bushes on the sides of the road and to listen in which language their parents have a conversation. And if, God forbid, they hear either Russian or Yiddish, they had permission to jump from behind the bush and prick their parents' tuches with the needle that they got from Eliezer Ben Yehuda. And hence, with violence, we conquered Rehovot. Story number 2 about Ben Yehuda violence. A few years ago, I get an email from a lady whom I did not know, and she says, "Dear Mr. Hovav, my father just passed away. I want to publish a book of his writings and letters." And there is a letter in which he describes a visit to the Ben Yehuda residence. They lived in a one-room apartment on the second floor in the old city, only there wasn't a staircase in the building, so they had to climb a ladder to get home. But a visit to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, and I want to publish it, but I need your permission. So I say, it's very kind of you to ask for permission, but even according to the Israeli law, if one side of the correspondence is okay with its publication, it's totally kosher, you don't need my permission, do as you please. And she says, "Young man, you want to read this letter before it's published." I say, "Okay, send it over." In the letter, this person describes a visit to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, and he says that he sat with him at the table, and when Dvorah, his wife, entered the room and served a tray of tea and cookies, he saw that both her arms were black with bruises of pinches. Now, this is not a funny story. It's not a nice story. He was violent. He wasn't beating his wife, but he was violent to his wife. But you see, he was a prophet, and prophets have extra rights. Prophets have no sense of humor, and they fail to see that there are a few ways to read reality. They see only one light, and they walk straight to it. But if we're lucky enough to live next to a true prophet, we gain from their madness. And, I did not know my grandfather, of whom we'll talk in a minute, Itamar ben Avi, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, eldest son, but I knew his brother and sisters, and they were all in love with Eliezer Ben Yehuda. They admired him. Whenever they would talk to me about him, they won't say Abba or Abba Sheli or Avi. They won't say dad or my dad. They would say my illustrious father. They admired him. And they kept thanking not the Lord, because in my family we do not believe in God, but they kept thanking destiny for putting them next to such a great man. So as we said, life in Jerusalem, this is Dvorah, this is the first wife of Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Life of Eliezer in Jerusalem, and this is Chemda, this is the second wife. And they were sisters. I'll talk about it in a minute. Life in Jerusalem was very difficult. They were poor. Many of their children died. 5 of Eliezer Ben, and these are my parents. It has no connection to the story of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, but my mom, that you see in the picture, who was a raving beauty, is Eliezer Ben Yehuda's eldest granddaughter. Life in Jerusalem was very difficult. The family was persecuted by the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem. Eliezer Ben Yehuda got along with the religious community in Jerusalem, but the ultra-Orthodox persecuted him. They cast the Pulsa de Nura. Pulsa de Nura is the most stern boycott in Judaism. You know, rabbis light black candles in the middle of the night and cast curses on. Twice we got the Pulsa de Nura, and it works until 4th generation. So if now we all die, it's because of me, because I'm 4th generation. But so far we're doing quite well. As I said, they would throw stones at him. They refused to bury his children, his 5 children who died. They would not deal with him financially. They told the Ottoman rulers of the country that he was a British spy and he sat in jail. And my grandfather, his eldest son, Itamar ben Avi, at the time when he was born, was called Ben Yehuda, was the loneliest child in Palestine because he was supposed to hear only Hebrew, and it was forbidden for him to play with anyone who did not speak Hebrew, but there were no Hebrew-speaking children in the world. Think of it, you're a child who cannot have friends in the world because you're the only child that speaks Hebrew in the world, in the entire universe. And his only friend was a dog, because dogs cannot bark in Yiddish. And one day when he was 4 years old, he walked the street in Jerusalem with his dog, and ultra-Orthodox people started chasing them and throwing stones at them. He was miraculously saved by an Arab person who wrapped him in his coat, and they ran away, but the dog was killed, and his only friend. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda buries the dog in the yard, and he writes on the tombstone, Po nitman hakelev ha'ivri harishon. Here lies the first Hebrew dog. 10 years after they immigrate to Palestine, Dvorah contracts tuberculosis from Eliezer Ben Yehuda and dies. And he writes a telegram to her family in Russia, this well-to-do family, the Yonas family. It's before the First World War. Jews were very comfortable in Moscow at the time. And he says, your daughter died. Within 3 weeks, 3 of our children died. I'm left with 2 orphans, my eldest, Ben Zion, and his sister, Yemima. I want to marry your daughter's younger sister, who was 15 years younger than himself. Immediately, he gets a telegram, a brilliant idea. They admired him. And people in Jerusalem tell him, what are you doing? You killed the first one, you'll kill the second one. What does she have to do with you? She's a brilliant student of chemistry in the University of Moscow from a rich family. Why do you want to grab her to this sick country, to marry an elderly person like yourself, to be a mother of 2 orphans? What are you doing? Let her go. And as he did with her elder sister, he writes a telegram to Russia saying, you do not have to come. And she writes a telegram back, on my way, wait for a letter. And he gets the letter in which he writes, I am coming to you, and be it for an hour or a day or a year or for the whole of my life, this is my destiny. And he goes to Turkey. They meet in Turkey. She comes from Russia. He comes from Palestine. They get married in Turkey, get to Jaffa by boat, and take the carriage to Jerusalem through Bab el Wad, through the valley that leads to Jerusalem. And she wrote a book about it in which she describes this wedding trip of hers to the gates of Jerusalem, where the 2 orphans are standing and waiting for her, their half aunt, half new mother. And I read this description and I say to myself, you know, this is aristocracy. This is Mayflower. This is how Zionism was made. And then she gets to the point when she sees the 2 children and she says, 2 such ugly, filthy monkeys I've never seen in my life. And I tell myself, this is the aristocracy that you are, Mr. Gil Hovav. Remember, a filthy monkey. This is us. We should talk just a tiny bit about Chemda. I don't want to talk too much, but we should. The young sister is called Chemda. Her name was Beile. He changed her name to Chemda. And we should talk about her for a bit, because as many of you know, especially if you're women, history is often unkind to women. And in many cases, the achievements of women are attributed to the men they lived with. Now, the revival of spoken Hebrew is totally the achievement of Eliezer Ben Yehuda. It's his, and he wrote the big dictionary. We can't take it away from him, nor do we wish to. But had it not been for Chemda, we wouldn't have had the big dictionary. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the big dictionary. When I tell youngsters that it's as big as the Encyclopedia Britannica, they look at me and say, as big as what? So I say, as big as Wikipedia, okay? It's huge. It's 17 huge volumes. This is a project that nations take upon themselves, not sickly, blood-coughing men, you know, at the October of their lives, standing up for 18 hours a day and writing new words. At the time, publishing a volume of the dictionary, the cost was $5 million. Now, they did not have enough money for bread. Chemda writes in her book that some days, the only thing that would come into their mouth is the glue of the stamps with which they sent the newspapers to the settlements. So $5 million is, you know, science fiction. She got the money. She traveled the world, a woman by herself at the turn of the 20th century, by boat, by camel, by train, you name it, to the States and to England and to Russia and to Iraq and to North Africa and to France to get money, to beg, borrow, and steal, and get money for the publication of the volumes of the dictionary. Eliezer Ben Yehuda died in 1922 when only 5 volumes of the dictionary were in print. His big victory that he managed to see in his life was the victory in what we call the War of Languages. It was the very big war about in which language they would teach in the new universities, Jewish universities, that were built in Palestine after 2,000 years. The Technion in Haifa and the university in Jerusalem. Now, everybody thought that in the universities, they would teach in the language of science. Nowadays, it's English with a foreign accent, but at the time, it was German. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda waged a war upon the Technion, and the building of the Technion stopped for 4 years, and then it was opened in Hebrew. And at 1921, there is a big ceremony on the Mount of Scopus. They start building the University of Jerusalem. I'm a graduate of this university. It's called the Hebrew U. We all know that the University of Jerusalem is the Hebrew U. No. It's because it promised that it would teach only in Hebrew. It pledged to teach in Hebrew. This is why it's called the Hebrew U. And this is the victory that he got to see. But as I say, when he died, only 5 volumes of the 17 of the big dictionary were in print. So I would like to almost end this short conversation with a nice story about how Chemda died. Because Chemda, his second wife, took it upon herself to go on with the publication and with the printing of the big dictionary. But when she was already dying at 1951, 30 years after he died, only 11 volumes were in print. So the story of how she died, I heard it from Eliezer Ben Yehuda's grandson. We call him Little Eliezer. His name, of course, is Eliezer, but Eliezer Ben Yehuda is the big Eliezer. This is the little Eliezer. So Eliezer Ben Yehuda, when he married Chemda, his second wife, had a son and 3 daughters. The son had a boy and a girl. He named the boy Eliezer, after his father, and he named the girl Eliezra, after his father. Well, crazy family. Anyway, Chemda is dying. She is bedridden in the house of the Ben Yehuda family in Jerusalem. She's alone at home with her 8-year-old grandson, little Eliezer. She calls him to her room and she says, Eliezer, take this piece of paper. You'll find a phone number on it. Dial it and tell them that Chemda Ben Yehuda says that David and Moshe must come right away. He phones, he tells, Chemda Ben Yehuda says that David and Moshe must come right away. 20 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. David and Moshe are there. What do we learn from this story? That in Israel of 1951, when an 8-year-old kid phones the office of the prime minister and says, Chemda Ben Yehuda says that David and Moshe must come right away, David Ben Gurion, the prime minister, and Moshe Sharet, the secretary of state, come right away because they were all terrified of her. She was a horrible, horrible, horrible woman. All of Jerusalem was terrified of her. And she lies there in bed like this, covered to her chin, and they stand shaking at her bed. She looks at them and she says, guys, I am going to die, but I will not die until I hear you promising me that the big dictionary is going to be printed to the end. Now they were so horrified that immediately they went like this and she said, no, don't nod at me. You will say it with your mouth. And if you don't say it, I won't die. So they said yes, and she died. But because of her and because of him, I have a country, and I have a homeland, and I have a language, and I have my culture and pride, and I know who I am, and I have a daughter, 17 and a half years old, and every morning when she gets up, she opens her beautiful eyes and she doesn't say, I love you, and she doesn't say, je t'aime, and she doesn't say, ana bahibak. She says, ani ohevet otcha. So I guess it was worth it. And only because you behaved, I'll tell you the end of the first story, and then we'll take questions. So picture me at the newspaper getting word that it happened yet again, not knowing whether I should phone my aunt and tell her that the graves were desecrated. In the end, I said, well, what can I do? She'll read about it in the newspaper the next day anyway. So I phoned her up and I said, Aunt Trina, I'm so sorry, I have an unpleasant piece of news. And she told me, Gili, did you only get word of it, or did you also get photos of what happened? And I said, yeah, come on, leave it. Oh, well, I'll send photos of the desecrated graves of her family to my elderly aunt. And she said, no. You don't have to send anything to me. I want you to look at the pictures. I said, yes. She said, the graffitis on the graves, in which language? And I said, in Hebrew. And she said, yes, we won. This is the story of the revival of Hebrew. Thank you so much for listening. And now, with the help of Amir Tadmor, the Director of Cultural Affairs at the Consulate, we'll take questions gladly.
Thank you so much, Gil, for this fascinating and entertaining show. So we have some questions from our viewers in Zoom and Facebook, and we'll start by a question from Bonnie Alpert. Bonnie asks, how did Jewish society in Palestine learn enough Hebrew to teach and learn in this language by the 1920s?
So again, Hebrew was already starting to bud in Europe. So some of the pioneers that came to Palestine in the late 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century knew Hebrew from their schools in Poland, the Ukraine, France, etc. But again, they could hardly speak. They had vocabulary, but they could hardly speak. But when they took it upon themselves to speak in Hebrew, they did. And it was a strange language. And these were, I'm sure, strange conversations. but it was, it was their task, and they stuck to it, and they did. So they had the basic language, be it from prayer and be it from schools in the old land. But then when they came to Palestine and decided to be Zionists, they took it upon themselves to speak Hebrew.
Thank you. We have another question from our Hannah. Hannah asks, why were ultra-Orthodox so opposed to the use of modern Hebrew? Has their attitude changed in recent years?
So there were two main reasons for their refusing to speak in Hebrew. One is a religious reason. Hebrew is a sacred language. It is not meant to be used in the bathroom. And they wanted Hebrew to be used only for prayer. The second reason was political. When Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who was a raging Zionist, came to Palestine, he saw that the ultra-Orthodox do not work. They just sit and study and pray, and they are dependent on donations from abroad. Some things never change, do they? But being a Zionist, he really opposed to this. He said, we came here to build a new nation, a healthy nation, a nation of working people. And he wrote, being the annoying person that he was, he wrote articles to all the Jewish newspapers around the world saying, stop sending them money. Tell them to go and work. And of course, this made him their worst enemy. And they really, 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 persecuted him in every way.
Okay, so the next question is from Mark Bernstein, who says, it's interesting that both Eliezer Ben Yehuda and Bialik lost their fathers at a young age, and both were sent off away from home to grow up without love. How much do you think this shared trauma motivated them to become revivers of the language and literature?
Actually, first of all, it's interesting. Secondly, I'm not sure that that this is what made them revive the language, because this trauma, this kind of trauma was very common. People were dying young. Childbirth was very common. As I said, Eliezer Ben Yehuda lost 5 children, but people were sent away from home for financial reasons, etc. So it's true that both great men shared a very sad story of childhood, but this did not make them good friends at all. Actually, they were rivals. I must say that I admire Bialik, and Bialik, by the way, revived more words than Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Right? It's no competition. And as I said, the big thing that Eliezer Ben Yehuda was reviving the spoken language. The only family that spoke Hebrew at home at the time was the Ben Yehuda family. This is something Bialik did not do. But when it has to do with the coming up with new words in Hebrew, Bialik was a reviver of words. He did not like Eliezer Ben Yehuda because he did not appreciate his education. And he did not understand who was that, as he called him, red-headed little Jew from the East that took control of the Hebrew language. Now, Bialik wanted Hebrew to be revived, but he said that everything should be taken from the Bible. So he said, we should come up with a committee in Odessa, and it would sit for months, and then it would send us the new words. In the meantime, the pioneers in the fields did not have a common language. Some of them came from the Ukraine, some of them came from France, some came from Syria, and some came from the States. The Tower of Babel collapsed because the Masons did not have a common language. They would write letters saying, what is the name of the scissors with which you take off the grapes from the vine? Bialik says, wait until we get an answer from Odessa. Ben Yehuda says, Mazmera. immediately his word caught. So Eliezer Ben Yehuda's freshness got on Bialik's nerves. But in many cases, the words that Bialik came up with were better and were accepted when the words of Eliezer Ben Yehuda were not. For instance, the word for a tomato. You know, in French, a tomato is a pomme d'amour, an apple of love. So Bialik came up with the word agvania, which is almost cheeky. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda said it is too fresh. And he came with the word badura, which comes from the bandora in Arabic. In Arabic, a tomato is a bandora. And Bialik's word got to be, you know, the word that we use today. We say agvania, we don't say badura. So Bialik has lots going for him. And I'm not sure that it's all because both of them lost their fathers in an early age.
Thank you, Gil. We have a question from Arnie Winchell from Hebrew at the Center, Hivrit B'Merkaz. Arnie is asking, how would you suggest to inspire diaspora Jews to reclaim the passion for the Hebrew language?
You know, it's a great question. And I'll tell you, even a tougher problem. You know, I travel the world and lecture about Hebrew when there's no COVID. Lots of the work is done with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with guys like you. And wherever I get to, there's a dead language that somebody is trying to revive. Be it the Aboriginal people in Australia or in Norway, and be it, of course, in the Catalan in Spain, or be it Welsh, or be it, and people always tell me, this miracle happened only once in history, a dead language coming to life. Only once. You know, if you look at the best example, except for Hebrew, that there is, so it would be Catalan. In Catalonia, you see it on street signs, and they write poetry in Catalan. But no child in Barcelona speaks Catalan when he's a child. It speaks Catalan at home. They speak Spanish, and then they learn Catalan. Only Hebrew became a mother tongue again. And they say, how can we make people reclaim their language? And I tell them, you cannot, because you're so well off. You're comfortable. You should remember that reviving Hebrew was a political act. Eliezer Ben Yehuda loved languages and loved Hebrew, but what he wanted was an independent state. This is what he fought for. And he said Hebrew is a means to get your land. By the way, there's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story about Churchill asking Weizmann and Ben Gurion, but why do you need independence? So Ben Gurion said, because we have a language that has no country. And Weizmann said, because. Anyway, I think that if you're comfortable and if your life is good, it's very difficult to have the passion to adopt a new language. So when I look at Jews in the diaspora, as much as, you know, I love you, I'm not too sure that your children would be that keen on going to Sunday school and learning Hebrew, because English is good and useful and wonderful. I do not have an answer for this. It's sad, but I do not have an answer for this. Hebrew is alive in Israel.
Okay, thank you, Gil. I think, well, we have so many questions, but our time is short, so I think we will finish with this. There is another question: how is Gil's English so perfect? But I think you can answer it in your next time you come to Boston. And we'll go back to Esther now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating. Thank you, Gil, first of all. That was very interesting. And thank you all for participating in the first event of How to Revive a Dead Language in 100 Years. The next event will take place on January 14th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time with Professor Gilad Zuckerman, who will try to answer the question, do Israeli really speak Hebrew? And thank you again to the Israeli Consulate in Boston for hosting these fascinating events. Shalom, and have a safe and happy and healthy new year, better than last year. Shalom.